Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jeff Cucina. I am the chair of the SIOP History Committee, or the SIOP Historian, and welcome to the third installment of the SIOP Living History Series. Part of the SIOP Living History Series is an initiative for the SIOP historian to interview a historic I.O. figure during each SIOP conference. And, you know, there's really no better way I can think of to learn about the early activities of SIOP than by listening to our early contributors' experiences directly from them. So today we will be interviewing Frank Schmidt. Frank is the professor emeritus at the Tippie College of Business, the University of Iowa. He's authored over 200 publications. His citation count increases about every week by about 1,000, it seems like, since we've been corresponding on this. He's cited 36,092 times, according to Google Scholar. His H-index is 76. He was identified by Potsakoff as being in the 99th percentile for citations within management. Popular personnel selection textbooks cite him and his research partner, Jack Hunter, more frequently than any other set of textbooks. His meta-analysis textbook, the most recent version, came out last year, and his Psych Bulletin article on 98 years of personnel selection research have been cited 4,700 and about 2,800 times, respectively. As one of my research psychologist coworkers recently opined, if you need a cite for something, it's likely Schmidt and Hunter. His career has spanned both academia and practice, so he's had positions at the U.S. Civil Service Commission, Michigan State University, George Washington University, and the University of Iowa. He's won numerous awards and honors, including the APA Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award that was run joint with Jack Hunter in 1994, SIOP's Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award, another joint award that he won the following year, SIOP Cattell Research Design Award, also run with Jack Hunter in 1974, and the list goes on, including a Gold Medal Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Foundation. So if we could all welcome Frank Schmidt. Okay, so the way this session works is we have some questions we're going to ask Frank about his life and his career. And then at the end of the session, if we have time, we'll open it up to any additional questions that you all have. There's no one in this room after this session, so we can go a little bit over, and you will have some time to mingle with him as well afterwards. Okay, so we have a picture of Frank here, and we'll kind of get right into his early life. So can you tell us about your early life, where you grew up, where you went to school?
I grew up near the small town of Jeffersontown in Kentucky, which was not too far from Louisville, and grew up on a farm and had a lot of adventures, some of them pretty problematic during that time. And I have recently written a memoir, which is now available on Amazon, that you always go to these things so you can plug your book. And it contains all these stories and escapades and so on. That was solely to save time during this thing so we could move on. Well, you wanted to go, you want college and graduate student days and so forth?
Yeah.
I was a biology major. Technically, I'm really a double major, biology and psychology, but I never officially made it a double major. But I had advanced placement credit in biology when I went into college, 13 hours of that. As a graduate student, I was very fortunate because of the Soviet Union. They put Sputnik up, and that caused Congress to pass the National Defense Education Act, which included very lucrative fellowships, and I had one through graduate school, and it was really a blessing. I mean, I did not have to attach myself to any particular professor to get TAs and RAs because I had this fellowship. The professors that influenced me the most were Hubert Brogdon and Bill Owens, and especially Hubert Brogdon. And I think later we're going to see, there's a picture of him there. He was the former technical director of chief methodologist, really, of the Army Research Institute. And I'll be talking about his influence later on in the interview.
Great. So what were you like as a graduate student, and like what was your dissertation topic?
It's something that really is related to later developments like meta-analysis. The purpose of my dissertation was to determine how good regression weights were computed on the typical small samples that were used in IO psychology. And the upshot, this is a computer simulation study, and we were able to cross-validate in the population. And it turns out that unless you have a rather large samples, you're better off not using regression because there's a huge amount of sampling error in the regression weights, and you're better off just using equal weights or unit weights. And this is part of the kind of a theme that has run through my life and Jack Hunter's life, which is what do data really mean, and how can you make data tell you the truth, and how can you avoid the lies that data tell? And so we'll see that with meta-analysis and moderator variables and other things that we looked at. When I finished my PhD, I had initially 2 job offers. One was from the U.S. Civil Service Commission, which I later on went to, and one was from the CIA. Now, if you get an offer from the CIA, you're never going to probably be able to get anything published, because the clearance takes 7 years to get anything cleared to be published. I had professors that said, you don't take either one of those offers. You'd be better off going to a university, a good university, where you have a chance to establish yourself by publishing. It just turned out that at that time, Michigan State had an opening, so I went up there and interviewed, and this was in May of 1970, and student protests against the Vietnam War were at their peak, and Michigan State campus was a war zone. I mean, there was burned out buildings and broken glass and students camping out in huts everywhere and so on. But I took the job anyway, and that's how I launched my career there. I did, while I was there, that's of course where I met Jack Hunter, and that launched a multi-decade collaboration. But I also worked with a guy named Bill Crano, a social psychologist there, and he had gotten early tenure after 3 years. And he said, "Gosh, Frank, your resume, your publication record looks as good as mine. You ought to put in for early tenure." And that thought had never crossed my mind, but on his suggestion, I did it, and that's how I got the early tenure.
Wow, so you got tenure after just 3 years.
Right.
Amazing.
But then, okay, I was in an area of applied psychology, teaching applied psychology, but except for a brief stint with the General Motors Institute and some consulting I'd done, I hadn't really been out in the so-called real world applying this. And so I felt maybe I need some real world experience. So after 4 years, I left and went to the Civil Service Commission. They still held that offer open for me. And I found out, of course, that the real world is not really real, but nevertheless, it turned out to be a good move.
So you were at the Civil Service Commission from 1974 to 1985.
Right, 11 years.
11 years. Can you tell us about some of your work that you did there at the Civil Service Commission, which is now called the Office of Personnel Management?
Yes, but let me first give you a little bit of information about OPM. In the 1880s, a law called the Pendleton Act was passed, and the purpose of that was to eliminate the spoil system and make federal hiring merit-based. And that was our major job at the Civil Service Commission, to make sure that federal hiring was merit-based and was not based on political payoffs, which of course lead to a corrupt government. Well, Carter got something called the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 passed, and it went in some direction, in the direction of restoring the spoils system. It greatly increased the number of people that could be hired on the political basis without meeting merit requirements, and the head of the, Carter's head of the Civil Service Commission was a guy named Scotty Campbell. Scotty Campbell said that he met with us and said, well, I meet with Jimmy Carter every week, and he tells me what he wants me to be doing here. And what he wants me to be doing is getting rid of these tests that he had been developing for selecting mostly tests for either mental ability tests or heavily loaded on G factor. And we presented all of the evidence to Campbell showing these tests were not only very predictive, but were fair to all the groups, in the sense that no matter what your group status, people with the same test score had the same later job performance, predictive fairness of tests. And he said, well, even if I wanted to believe your research, it wouldn't make any difference, because I've gotten my orders from the White House, and Carter wants to eliminate these tests. We just went back to doing, after that, we went back to doing what we had been doing, namely what we had was our obligation by law to do, which was to base hiring on merit. And finally, just before, I guess it was about let's see, Carter came in 76. No, it was about 79. He called all of us up to Scotty Campbell did, the head of the agency, called us up to his big conference room on the 7th floor and said, you're still not supporting our policy. And his right-hand man, Jewel Sugarman, the associate director, said, we know how this social science research works. You can make the results come out any way you want them to come out, and you're making them come out in a way that doesn't support our policy. It's against our policy. And he said, well, Campbell said, well, we're not going to do anything right now, but after the election, there are going to be some big changes around here, and you might want to start looking for another job right now. And of course, that never happened. He lost to Reagan, and the interesting irony, after he lost his job as well as the election, and he took a job with a food company called Cisco. He was the HR director there. So then he calls us up and says, you know, those tests you have here, what would be the best tests that we should use to hire people? And we said, well, Scotty, you said you didn't believe in these tests. He said, well, things are different now. I had an adjunct appointment at George Washington University while I was there, and that was really great. Jim Moselle was the chief IO psychologist in the program there, and he invited me to be an adjunct there. I had my own office, and even was allowed to direct dissertations, as well as teach PhD courses, which is unusual for an adjunct. I directed dissertations, Mike McDaniel, Ken Perlman, Brian Stern, Ray Colangelo, and some others. There are a bunch of them are up there.
We have some in the audience, too.
Yeah, a lot of them are still alive. The next question is recruitment to Iowa, or what?
Yeah, so after you were at GW for about 11 years, and then you left GW, you left OPM, and you returned to the Midwest.
Right. I was recruited ultimately successfully to the University of Iowa, and here's the way it worked. I met a professor there, Dwayne Thompson, at a SIOP conference, and he wanted me to consider a position there, and I said, well, I'm happy at OPM. I really don't well. He said, okay, just come out and visit and give a talk, and we'll take you pheasant hunting. So I went out there in 1982, I think, the first time, and they took me pheasant hunting. I gave a talk, and they took me pheasant hunting, and we started at 8 o'clock in the morning with Dwayne, and we walked all morning through this high switchgrass stuff at the wildlife area, and at noon, Dwayne said he was exhausted and he couldn't go back out in the afternoon, so I called up another professor, Peter Schoderbeck, and he hunted with me in the afternoon. And I got my 3 pheasants, and I took them back to the Holiday Inn where I was staying, and I cleaned them in the bathtub of the Holiday Inn. I picked them and gutted them and put all the feathers and intestines in a plastic bag and put it in the trash can in front of the Holiday Inn. And then Dwayne called me up and said, invited me over to his house for dinner, and I took the pheasants with me so they could freeze them for the trip back, and they were astounded that they were already cleaned. I can't believe you cleaned pheasants in the bathtub of the Holiday Inn. So that was the first year, and I still didn't agree to go there. And then they had me out for another year of pheasant hunting and giving a talk. And the third time they did it, I finally broke down and said, okay, I'm going to come. And that was later. Dwayne got an award from SHRM for creative faculty recruiting methods via pheasant hunting. So that's how I got to Iowa. And, well, what's the next question?
So in your career, you've been a professor, an expert witness, an author, advisor, practitioner. Which did you enjoy the most, and what did you enjoy the least?
I pretty much enjoyed all of it except some of the faculty meetings and the service stuff. But what I enjoyed the most was something that sort of obsessed me, and actually Jack Hunter too, and of course we worked closely together, was the epistemological riddle that I referred to earlier of how to get valid cumulative knowledge from empirical data, when empirical data is bound and determined frequently just to lie flat out to you. Here are some examples of our efforts in that area. One, strongly advocating confidence intervals and effect sizes to replace significance testing. That's a great improvement from the epistemological point of view. We did an article on what it takes to successfully identify moderator variables, published in Personnel Psychology. You need several thousand people in each group to have an accurate identification of people love moderator variables, especially in IO psychology, and they will attempt to look for them with samples of 100 or so, and they're highly unlikely if they're found to be real or to replicate. I mentioned the regression weights, the question of over-reliance and overconfidence in regression weights because they seem to be empirical. They don't work very well. Single group validity, differential validity by race, thought to be a real phenomenon, but proper analysis of large sample data sets showed they don't exist. There isn't any single group validity. There aren't any racial differences in test validity. There aren't any racial differences in predictability. And then meta-analysis, which was, you might say, our last major attempt to improve the way we attempt to generate cumulative knowledge in our field.
So with over 200 publications, and your career has been more productive than most IO psychologists, you also mentor a lot of the great names in personnel selection in the field, like Mike McDaniel, Denise Onez, Ken Perlman, Vish Viswaswaran. What words of wisdoms do you have for new academics? So if, like in IO psychologists that are at the beginning of their career who aspire to achieve some of the success that you've had?
Well, the main advice I would give is make sure that you choose something that really motivates you and fascinates you, something that you're extremely interested in. And I mentioned what the theme was that Jack Hunter and I had, which was a basic theme. How do you get valid knowledge from empirical data? If you succeed in glomming onto a theme or a deep interest like that, then your work will be your hobby. And I kind of feel that most of what I've done, I've mostly made a living by pursuing my hobby. And it's very motivating when it's your hobby. So that would be my main advice. Don't be one of those people, and I've met them, who said, "Oh, I'm only interested in getting tenure, and I'm only interested in, I'm not really interested in this research, but I just do it because I got to get tenure and maybe get a raise." It's not very motivating.
Great. So perhaps every SIOP member has either conducted a meta-analysis, learned how to do one, or read one in a journal at some point in their careers. And you and Jack Hunter were one of the pioneers to that methodology. What inspired you to work in this area?
Well, we did this work at OPM. Jack was not at OPM, but I was in close contact with him by what they now call snail mail, and we talked on the phone a lot. And so Jack and I developed it, and you got to remember the situation that existed when I went to OPM. This was the time, it was a time of maximum court challenges to selection procedures, much more frequent than today. And OPM needed means of defending the, in court if necessary, the validity of selection procedures that were used. One of our tests went all the way to the Supreme Court and was upheld. In fact, the only time I've ever been in the Supreme Court was when that test was being litigated, and so we had that. But the main defense for selection procedures was criterion-related validity. But our StatPat power paper showed that that's a very iffy strategy, because the average statistical power is about 50-50. It's like flipping a coin. If you're lucky, you will get significant validity. If you're not, you won't. And in fact, when we published the stat power paper showing this, I got a call from Ray Johnson at Ford Motor Company, a former student of mine from MSU, and he said, "Ford Motor, we read that paper at Ford Motor, and we canceled all of our current validity studies until we can get a large enough sample size to have high power, because ours had about 50. Well, if you don't get a significant validity because your power is 50%, and you can be taken, that can be used against you in court." So now the belief was that validity was situationally specific, so you had to do a validity study in every setting and in every employer. And typically, I'd arrive at work around 8 o'clock, and by 9 o'clock I'd be up at George Washington University in my office, sitting there and thinking and working. And one day I was doing that. I was looking at distributions of validity coefficients produced by Ed Gazelli, who compiled tremendous amounts of data on validity. And for the same job, the validities varied all the way from about a minus 0.25 to plus 0.65 or something of that sort. And I remembered an experience I had at Purdue University. I took a course from Joe Tiffin. Joe Tiffin was an IO psychologist who did a lot of validity studies for business and industry. And he said, he told the class, validity is very situationally specific. You know, if it works at a clerical job in Ford, it may not work in a clerical job at General Motors. And so you really got to do a study in every setting. Then I had a class with Brogdon, and the validities that he presented didn't jump all over the place. They were quite consistent from one study to another. Well, what was the difference? I asked him what was the difference, and he said it's difference in sampling error. He had about 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 subjects in each study. And Tiffin had 70, 80, maybe 100. He said it's all just sampling error. And then sitting there in my office at George Washington University, I remembered that and I tried to figure out, is there a way that I can estimate how much of the variation in this distribution by Gazzelli is sampling error? And I figured out a way to do that, and it turned out about 70, 80% of the variability was sampling error. And so I thought, wow, that is really something. But I thought, this is so surprising, I'm probably making an error. So I called up Jack Hunter, and he said, no, that's no error. That's really good. That's a really great idea. And then after you corrected for measurement error in the performance measure, not the test, performance measure, and range restriction, then you typically had a distribution that had a mean of about 0.50. We now know that was too low, but it was about 0.50 then, and the standard deviation was small enough that almost all the validities were in the positive range. That showed generalizability. And so I was, as I say, very relieved when Jack said, well, I don't think it's an error. I think it's correct. Now, we wrote that initial research up, but we did not submit it for publication till a year later. We wrote it up in late 1975. Division 14, which is now called SIOP, had a research design contest, and we entered it in that, and it was a requirement was it can't be published. So we couldn't even have it under review. So as a result, the first validity generalization or meta-analysis paper came out in 1977, and Glass published the first meta-analysis paper in 1976. We won that award, but if we hadn't submitted it for that award, then we would have tied Glass for having the first meta-analysis article ever published. The extent of generalization. First, what we showed was that for the same job, validity generalized across time, settings, companies, so forth. But what was really surprising was that the same thing held true when the jobs were very different. Jobs that were of the same general complexity level, but had widely varying tasks. They were not the same jobs. They were totally different jobs. And it still generalized across totally different jobs. So that was even more surprising, I would say. Well, Lee J. Cronbach was on a National Academy of Sciences committee studying personnel selection procedures. And I was appointed to be the OPM liaison to that committee. So I showed all this stuff to Cronbach, and he said, well, this is kind of similar to what Gene Glass is doing. You ought to, we had never heard of Gene Glass. And he said, you should learn about what Glass is doing. And he said, and you are too narrow in your focus on validity. These methods can be general, can be applied anywhere in psychology, and you should write a book doing that, and we did. In 1982, we published the first meta-analysis book, Schmidt, Hunter, and Jackson, but Glass and McGaw and Mary Lee Smith had their meta-analysis book, the first one, in 1981. So they beat us again by 1 year. So what's the next question?
So one area where your meta-analyses differ from others is that it's like a psychometric meta-analysis. It includes corrections for unreliability and range restriction. What led you to come up with the idea to include that when you were doing meta-analyses?
Well, maybe doing that in a meta-analysis was new, but making those corrections was not new. We were all taught in graduate school about the attenuating effects of measurement error, the biasing effects of measurement error, and I think it was fairly widely accepted. Not everybody did this, but it was fairly widely accepted that it was appropriate to correct for measurement error in the job performance measure and for range restriction. So we just simply, well, it was obvious that if you didn't do that in meta-analysis, you would have a very biased, downwardly biased results, and so we did it.
You've also mentioned in some of your past writings that initially there was some resistance to validity generalization. Can you tell us a little bit about the resistance that you ran into back in the day when you came out with the procedure?
Well, some of the resistance came from, there were two sources of resistance. One was from certain federal agencies like EOC, and the other was from a substantial number of practitioners who made their living doing situationally specific validity studies. In fact, one of them said to me, "What are you trying to do, Frank? You're trying to put me out of business?" Because these studies, our research showed you, there's really, as long as you're using ability tests, you don't need these studies. And that's really, later became true for a lot of other things, like the structured interview and so forth, as enough validity accumulated that you could do the meta-analyses and show that the validity generalized also. Okay, the other was, as I said, sorts of opposition from EEOC, OFCCP, and the Justice Department. They did not like it because they felt it made it easier for employers to demonstrate validity, and they wanted to torture employers as much as they possibly could. And not only were they opposed to validity generalization, and still are, they refused to revise the uniform guidelines, which came out in 1978. They're totally out of date from any kind of scientific or practitioner point of view, and in fact they're contrary to professional standards, APA principles, or the SIOP principles, and APA test standards, and so on. Which all recognize meta-analysis and validity generalization. So those were the main sources of opposition. There were three mitigating factors that caused the opposition to decline. The first was the fact that there was only one research area in which meta-analysis was controversial. That was personnel selection. All the other areas, and within I.O. and even outside I.O., it was meta-analysis was embraced and widely used, and there was no controversy at all. And there was an explosion of meta-analyses in non-selection areas in our literature. So it just seemed really, people began to realize it doesn't make sense that this is a wonderful thing in every area except this one area. The next development I have to give credit to to Milt Hockel. He was editor of Personnel Psychology, and I was telling him that we had collected a lot of objections to meta-analysis. Mike McDaniel and Ken Perlman and a lot of people at OPM, Hannah Rothstein. Every time we heard one, we'd write it down. One of them was, for example, a sampling error is just an hypothesis. It's not a fact. It's just you're just hypothesizing there's such a thing as sampling error. Well, anyway, we recorded 40 of these, and Milt Hochul said, why don't you draw up a document in which you answer each one of these? And then he asked other prominent IO psychologists like Paul Sackett and Neil Schmidt and so on to comment on our rebuttals to these objections. And then we actually even got to comment on their comment. And that was the longest article ever published in Personnel Psychology. It was 98 pages long. And I apparently successfully addressed most of the objections, because the objections were just kind of, they really dwindled after that. And the next thing occurred in 1994. Jack Hunter and I were given jointly the APA Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award for this research. And that was, I think that caught SIOP a little bit flat-footed, because they had not given us their, lower prestige award for scientific contribution. The next year they did. But, if you get the APA Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award for something, it's hard to say, well, that's just, I don't believe it. The road from initiation to acceptance was about 20 years. And Jack and I used to ask ourselves, if we knew in advance it was going to take 20 years of fighting, would we have done it? 20 years. I mean, just nothing happens fast.
So throughout your career, you collaborated a lot with Jack Hunter, and you said that you had met him initially at Michigan State University.
When I was interviewed.
When you were interviewed. Can you tell us how your typical collaboration went? What was it like working with him? So forth?
I certainly can. He was really an exceptional individual, exceptionally intelligent, scary smart. And he intimidated a lot of people. When I was at Michigan State, I noticed that most of the faculty wouldn't work with him because they were threatened by him, because but he was, I guess, threatening because of his intellect, but interpersonally he was extremely considerate, a warm person, and a great courteous, a great personal friend. But he was never, he never shied away from taking a controversial position as long as he knew the controversial position was correct. And I can tell you an anecdote about that. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the test that OPM used to hire college graduates because of the gap between the average scores of minorities, especially blacks, and the rest of the Caucasians. And so there were newspaper stories about this. So McNeil-Lehrer Report decided to do a story on it. And I got Jack to volunteer to go on McNeil-Lehrer Report on television. I took him to the studio, and I was in the back, in the backstage while he was being interviewed. We were watching it on the screens, and he said, and the question was, don't you think these tests are biased against minorities? And he said, or don't you think there's the difference shows that it's biased, it's not real, it's an artificial difference? He said, no, if it weren't real, it wouldn't show up in job performance. And all the studies show it shows up in job performance. It's not real. I mean, it's not an artificial difference or a biased difference. And all the technicians were right, or I was right around all the technicians. They really made really nasty, hostile remarks. I mean, it's like they wanted to assassinate him and for saying what he said. Now, that was a time, to put it in perspective, when the great majority of people believe tests were terribly biased. They don't believe that against blacks and other minorities. They don't believe that anymore. In education, they say the score differences show we're not doing a good job of educating people. But that was what it was then. But it didn't. There were many cases like that where he would. He simply did not. He was the one on our team who announced before 300 people at a SIOP conference that we now have conclusive evidence that general mental ability tests are valid for all jobs everywhere and so on, and that, boy, that was controversial enough. He had amazing powers of concentration. If he got interested in a problem, he could work all the way through the 24 hours, all the way through the night, and he would sit there like he was in a trance, and write down equations, and he'd sweat while he was doing it, and he'd do it for 24 hours. So that was really something. He hated any kind of clerical work, and everything that we published together, I submitted. I responded to the reviewers. I got his opinion, but he would never, he just didn't want to do that kind of stuff. It was boring to him. And as many of you know, he died in 2002, and because of his contributions, he had his obituary in the American Psychologist, which I wrote, and there's some, you should read it because there's some very unusual things in his background. For example, he was born in a circus tent, and many other strange things. So I would recommend that to you. I mean, he was a delight to work with, and I still feel a sense of loss after, what, 14 years.
So you have summarized, like, in the meta-analytic tables of going across 98 years of personnel selection research, and you kind of updated that in 2013. Do you think there's additional tests and, like, predictors of job performance that we haven't discovered that are out there?
Well, I'm sure there are, but I do not believe they're going to be in the cognitive domain. There can be additional non-cognitive predictors that we don't know about now. But that's not, to me, the main question. It's not zero order, do they have zero order validity? The main question to me is, do they have incremental validity over general mental ability? And I don't have time to go into it here today, but we've done some research that hasn't yet been published that shows that when you use the more accurate corrections for range restriction, there's a big decrease in the apparent level of incremental validity for non-cognitive things like conscientiousness and so on. Like overall, it's 40% reduction in incremental validity when you have a more accurate range restriction correction. So that's the question, is there any incremental validity to be had?
Interesting. So early on, you were doing a lot of your initial work back and really in the heyday of, like, social psychology, behavioral psychology, and cognitive psychology, and you were focusing primarily on individual differences. Did you and others encounter resistance from them, where they basically were treating individual differences almost as error, or that they weren't in existence?
Well, there was a minimal amount, I guess, of resistance from the behaviorist-oriented people, the behaviorists. But that was a movement that was dying. It was going. It was in the process of being replaced by cognitive psychology. But it was social psychology that was the most negative, and not just towards this work, but towards all individual differences. When I was in graduate school, an experimental social psychologist told me that, well, Frank, you're interested in individual differences. Well, 20 years from now, there won't be any such thing, because it will all be explained away by the treatment conditions that we use in our lab studies. There's no, that's all just, it's just going to disappear. Well, today, the field of individual differences, and not just selection validity and not just I/O, is thriving, maybe as never before. And what social psychology is in a state of crisis because of the questioning of the trustworthiness of the results of the lab studies, especially the priming studies and so on, the use of questionable research practices. And so I think that turned out pretty well. Now what about cognitive psychology? For quite a while, they ignored the individual differences area, but that has really been changing in recent years. For example, people like Randy Engel and Zach Hambrick, who were focused on what's it called? Let me see if I got this here. Working memory. Okay. Now more articles are coming out saying, well, gosh dang, working memory is highly correlated with general intelligence. Well, working memory is, it's not just some property of people, it varies. It's an individual difference variable. So, I think cognitive psychology is coming around.
I've noticed you've been a reviewer at Personal Psychology for nearly 40 years. How do you feel that the field's journals have changed over that time, since you first started reviewing back in '75?
Well, back then, and before that, all the way in the 60s and the 50s, our field was too Dust Bowl empiricist. There was very little attempt to, everything was just purely atheoretical empiricism. But today, we've gone too far in the opposite direction. There's too much of an emphasis on theory, and I would refer you to the article by Donald Hambrick, 2007, in which he explained how it's distorting what is appearing in our literature. I'll give you a personal example of that. In 2002, Jim Harder and Ted Hayes and I published, using Gallup data, very large sample study in Journal of Applied, showing a correlation. It was a concurrent correlation between employee engagement and business unit outcomes, like profit and revenue and so forth. But it was concurrent, and you couldn't tell, there was no test of the direction of causality. By 2012 or 13, we had longitudinal data, so we could see if the difference between, if engagement comes first and followed by financial outcomes, or vice versa. And we had a huge sample of data, something like 1,700 business units, and Journal of Applied would not, 10 years later, they wouldn't publish it. Why? They didn't say you're not testing a theory. They're saying you're not testing the theory we want you to test. And they wouldn't publish. We published it in the APS journal. But it was in a 10-year period. Journal of Applied had, in my opinion, deteriorated to that degree that they wouldn't publish really great data sets that answered important applied questions because somebody's favorite theory wasn't the one that we were testing. Well, the top tier journals today, and this is something, a point was brought out by Jose Cortina earlier in this conference. They seek novel and surprising findings. That's what they want, something unexpected and shocking. Well, guess what? Those are the things that almost never replicate. And there are also the kinds of things that are very often have to be retracted. It's very interesting that not just in psychology, but across all the scientific areas, the higher the impact factor of the journal, the more frequent the retractions are. So I think in a lot of ways, we're in a situation now where the best journals are the worst journals as far as scientific epistemology goes. They're publishing stuff that's, they're rejecting a lot of stuff that should be published, and a lot of what they're publishing is not really, won't replicate, and it's not reliable.
So you've always called for higher standards in IO research. What do you think are the main areas that we should improve in?
Well, let me start by saying that the advent and widespread use today of meta-analysis in all areas, not just in IO, has greatly improved the quality and reliability and validity of our cumulative knowledge. But we have a big problem with questionable research practices, and that I'm including publication bias there, as well as the typically considered questionable research practices, such as you add subjects to your lab experiment until you get statistical significance and then you stop. Or you drop studies or samples that are not significant and report only the ones that are significant. You run multiple significance tests, different kinds, and you only report the ones that turn out significant. You do harking. Everyone knows what harking is. You hypothesize after you have your data. Running lab experiments over and over until you get the desired results. I ran into that on the Promotion and Tenure Committee in marketing and behavioral marketing, behavioral accounting, and behavioral economics. These practices seem to be most common in experimental areas, experimental psychology, general and social psychology. Well, here I get a chance to plug another book, the 2014 meta-analysis book. In Chapter 13 has an extended discussion of these problems. What is the impact of these problems? Some people say, well, it causes a lot of type 1 errors. In certain social psychology areas, that's probably true. There may actually be no relationship. The null may be true. But in most areas, we got a lot of evidence showing the null is almost never true. So you don't make type 1 errors. What you do is you inflate effect sizes. And Mike McDaniel suggested in a session yesterday that you have to knock 30. The average meta-analytic estimate is probably 30% too high because of publication bias and questionable research practices. So that's the next main task. Publication bias and questionable research practices. That's where the real need is.
And briefly, and then we'll get to some questions, can you tell us what activities you've been up to since retirement in 2012?
Well, they've all been legal. Well, first I want to mention the huge retirement party that my former students, led by Denise Owens, provided me with at the 2013 SIOP. That was a major activity, and I even enjoyed all the roasting I got there, and the food was fantastic. Well, what else? Published the 3rd edition of the meta-analysis book, which is really the 4th, because the first one, the 1982 one, is not included in that. So it's really, there are 4 meta-analysis books that we've had. 82, 90, 2014, 2000, what was it? I think that's what it is, 90 and 14. I've published 12 research articles since retiring, but some of those were underway before I retired. 10 research talks, and I've got 4 more research awards, including one here at this conference. But one of them was the Ingram-Olkin Meta-Analysis Award from the Meta-Analysis Society of Research Synthesis Society, which is specifically for meta-analysis, nothing else. So I have been keeping busy, and it keeps me off the streets.
That's good. So I think we have time for a few audience questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Kim Johnston will come over with a microphone. No questions at all. Okay. We have a few additional resources. So in the next issue of TIP, we will have a short write-up on today's session, and we'll have a link to the video recording. We're recording it in video. It'll be posted to SIOP's YouTube version. We also have a text version of this interview. It's a little bit longer that we'll be posting on SIOP's website. In addition, Frank has also written his memoirs, and he gave a plug for them a little bit earlier. So you can contact him if you're interested in the link for that on Amazon. So if we could give everyone could give Frank a round of applause. Thank you all for coming today.